Hey Warriors, this video is for U.S. history, and we're going to talk today briefly about a quote given in a speech by Woodrow Wilson in 1917. Woodrow Wilson was the president at that time, and it's a quote from a speech that signifies a bit of a change in Woodrow Wilson's thinking about whether or not we should be involved in World War I. So this quote is found at the bottom of page 39 in your history booklet. So if you turn there, let's take a look at this quote together and then we'll talk about it. The quote is from, as I said, a speech that President Wilson gave shortly before we got involved in World War I. The speech was given on February 26, 1917. By April 6, 1917, about a month and a half later, we had declared war on Germany and entered World War I. So this is a pretty short period of time before we get involved in World War I. Up until this point, President Wilson had been telling the American people that World War I was a European issue. We were going to stay in North America and mind our own business and let the war happen. It didn't have anything to do with us. And people were, for the most part, fairly pleased with that. And so this speech that he gives, as I said, it signals a change in his thinking. He says, and this is a quote from the speech directly, "No one doubts what it is our duty to do. We must defend our commerce and the lives of our people in the midst of this present trying circumstance, with discretion, but with clear and steadfast purpose. Only the method and the extent remain to be chosen upon the occasion, if the occasion should indeed arise." Again, these words are spoken by the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, and he's saying essentially, look, we might have to get involved in World War I. And then he tells us why. And he gives two reasons. He says that we have to defend two things. First of all, he says we must defend our commerce. Commerce refers to business or our ability to do business. And then he says we must defend our people, meaning the American people, American citizens. So how is our ability to do business or our people, the citizens of the United States, how is any of that in danger if we're staying in North America and the war is happening in Europe? Well, let me tell you how. When the war starts in 1914, and we talked about this last time, World War I was a war of alliances. The United States began to manufacture, produce, and ship and sell military supplies to our allies, those countries with whom we had a friendly relationship, Britain being one of them, the primary one. And so we began to manufacture war supplies and sell them. Even though we weren't taking part in the war, we were selling supplies that were necessary for World War I, and we were making a lot of money doing it. And at that time, the primary method for shipping supplies was by boat or by ship. And so if we wanted to ship supplies to Britain or the British Isles, we would ship them essentially into the North Atlantic. Now, during World War I, Germany had a pretty sizable group of submarines. And they had these submarine units stationed in the North Atlantic. And they knew that war supplies were being shipped into England, and they were going to try to prevent it. So there was this a lot of kind of dancing around this issue where Germany would sink ships that were military ships that were, supposed to be shipping military supplies. But then the United States and Britain began to do something a little different. They began to ship military supply on passenger ships, on cruise liners, ocean liners. And so these might be ships that you might have a family going to Europe for a vacation. And in the belly of that ship, in the cargo hold of that ship, there may have been crates and crates and crates of weapons and ammunition and munitions. And Britain and the United States denied that they were doing this, but Germany suspected they were doing it anyway. So sometimes you'd have these passenger ships, and they might have some guns on the decks of the ship just to defend themselves if they had to, because a war was going on and you weren't quite sure what was ever going to happen. But during the time, there were things called international naval prize laws. And these laws said that you should warn a ship, if you were a submarine, for instance, in the North Atlantic, a German submarine, and you were going to begin to shoot at a ship that you knew citizens, passengers were on, you would say, contact the ship and say, look, we're getting ready to shoot your ship, and so you need to get those passengers off there. And they would hustle the passengers into lifeboats and get them out into the water. And when the passengers were safe, I know this kind of sounds ridiculous, but when the passengers were safe, then that submarine would go ahead and shoot the boat and sink it. So this comes into play a little bit later in the story. But there's this sort of back and forth. Germany's constantly kind of sinking ships or trying to get ships not to come into the North Atlantic to deliver supplies. And in 1915, in fact, they sunk an American ship, the William P. Fry, in January of 1915. This was a U.S. Ocean liner. In 1917, a very famous, what became a really famous ship sinking happened, and that was the Lusitania. And this was a British ship. It was also an ocean liner, a passenger ship. And this ship was sunk by the Germans. The Germans would sink a ship, and some country would get upset about it, and then the Germans would say, oh, we apologize, we won't do it again, and then the other country would settle down, and then Germany would sink another ship, and then a country would get upset, and Germany would say, oh, we're sorry, we won't do it again, we made a mistake, or whatever, right? But at some point here on into 1917, Germany says, look, if you bring anything into the North Atlantic in these waters that we're protecting with our submarines, we're going to sink it. So just don't come into these waters. And they basically declared a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. They were going to sink whatever came into those waters because they didn't want military supplies being delivered anymore. So this is the time when the Lusitania gets sank. When the Lusitania is shot and it sinks, there are 1,195 people on board who died. More people on board, but there were 1,195 people who died when that ship sank. 123 of those people were U.S. citizens. In the cargo hold of that ship, even though at the time America and Britain denied it, when the wreck of the Lusitania was explored by divers in 2008, 2009, they found secret cargo holds in that ship, cargo spaces that were not supposed to have had anything in them, according to the ship's records, that were full of ammunition and weapons. So they in fact were shipping weapons and ammunition on passenger boats. Germany sinks the boat, almost 1,200 people die, over 120 of them American citizens. And now we see Woodrow Wilson's words beginning to make sense. He says we have to defend our right to do business, our ability to do business. Okay, he's not saying that because someone's interfering in what's happening in the United States. Someone, in this case Germany, is interfering in what's happening when we try to ship military supply to our allies. And we must defend our people. Well, how did the people get in the middle of that war effort? Well, they were passengers on a passenger ship that was carrying military supplies. So now the quote by Woodrow Wilson begins to make a little more sense. I want you to respond to this quote. How do you feel about what the president is saying? What do you think it is that he's saying? Is it important that he mentions business first and people later, or am I just being picky? Okay, do you agree with the president, or do you disagree with the president? And why? Is our ability to do business with other countries, is that an important reason to get involved in World War I? Was our ability to do business an important enough reason to put innocent civilians' lives in danger by putting them on passenger ships that were also carrying military supplies? These are the things I want you to think about, And these are the things I want you to write about in your answer, maybe 4 or 5 sentences to the question on the bottom of page 39. How do you feel about this quote from Woodrow Wilson? What is the president actually saying in your opinion? This is all your opinion. It's not right or wrong. It's just your opinion. And do you agree or disagree with him? And why? Okay? A little something to think about, because these events, these are what pull us into World War I in April of 1917. By November 1918, the war is over. Our soldiers, and we shipped a ton of soldiers very quickly. Our soldiers, our military weaponry, our resources, our energy were poured into World War I. And when World War I ended, we were kind of understood to be the nation who turned the tide in that war. We were looked at as being very heroic as a result of that. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about what happens between World War I and World War II in our next lesson. But for now, I want you to answer these questions. What is the president saying? How do you feel about what the president is saying? And do you agree or disagree with him, and why? That's it for today's lesson. I'll see you next time.